Good afternoon. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgett. It's a problem that does not go away. Government after government, generation after generation. There's a housing crisis affecting too many First Nations, and the problem seems to exist off reserve too. Indigenous people are disproportionately affected in urban centres where there's a housing crunch. And then if we go to the north, there's a whole other side of problems facing Inuit people, Inuit there. We're going to be putting today housing in focus. Is the problem getting worse? Is it getting better? You might be surprised to learn that, in fact, it has improved in some circumstances. We'll get into that later in the show. Are there solutions that are working somewhere that could work somewhere else? What are the political parties saying on the topic, and does it even matter? What aren't we hearing? What do we want to hear? This is, of course, a call-in show, and we always love to hear from you as our conversation unfolds. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's take a look back at an APTN Investigates story from 2017 that deconstructed the housing crisis back then. It's not news that First Nations are gripped by a housing crisis. For decades, the federal government has tried to figure it out. The Liberals came with a housing policy in 1996 that was supposed to be a fix-all. It promised greater flexibility, more control to First Nations, and also more money. $160 million in additional funds were to be provided. Sounded nice. But 7 years later, Auditor General Sheila Fraser blasted the feds for a critical shortage of adequate housing to accommodate a young and growing on-reserve population, despite nearly $4 billion being spent. Fraser blamed Indian Affairs and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, also First Nations themselves, all for failing to understand their role in fixing the problem. Fast forward 8 more years, 2011. Aboriginal Affairs re-evaluates its 1996 housing program and finds not only is it still not working, but that the shortfall still exists and appears to be growing. And the result is overcrowding, 6 times higher than among other Canadians. The report went on to say with an existing backlog and forecasted rise in population, new needs are being generated as quickly as the housing can be built. By 2013, the Senate feels it's time that they get involved. They travel coast to coast for 2 full years and in the end conclude that indeed there are severe housing shortages and overcrowding, also poorly constructed housing in serious disrepair. Joining us now is Sylvia Olsen. She was a longtime housing manager for the Sartlip First Nation on Vancouver Island. But before that, she was married into a reserve house, actually in the 70s. She went on to write her PhD dissertation on the history of on-reserve housing in Canada and now teaches a reserve housing management certificate program at Vancouver Island University. And then we were supposed to have Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Kevin Hart joining in studio, and he might still. He's had the housing portfolio for 4 years, and he doesn't think that the housing crisis is going to end ever in his lifetime. I want to take a look at a clip from him from 2 years ago.
You know, our houses are built under code and such from 20, 30 years ago, and then you see them now. They're built below standard. They're built with substandard material. If you look at some of the houses on the First Nations,
it's a big problem, but what's the solution?
We have 634 First Nations, and if we build maybe 2 or 3 homes a year per First Nation, you know, that's only 1,800, 2,000 homes being built in any given year. Now, if you look at 175,000 homes short, and the number growing and growing each year with the increase of our population, you could see that we're being set up for failure right off the bat.
Sylvia, listening to that being set up for failure, your entire career has been spent looking at this problem. Is it really set up for failure?
Yes, it is. The system itself, I articulate that differently. I would say the system itself has not been set up to succeed. There's nothing in the system that has been arranged in order to find success. Yeah.
So, and how did you get in? So you married into the Sartlip First Nation. You have lived in reserve housing yourself. What got you interested in this as a profession?
So there was two things when I first moved onto the reserve as a mainstream Canadian teenager. Actually, I was only 17 years old. The first thing that you are struck with is, oh my God, this can't actually be the case in this country called Canada. So that underpinned everything that I thought and did. It's actually a strange vantage point to be looking through this housing situation from. But I didn't actually ask to get into housing. Most people don't. The Sartlip band manager says, we got some problem with our housing. How about you fix it?
And so then you took on the role of housing manager. Were you thinking, oh, yeah, I look around my community and I see that there's problems. I'll take on this job?
Yeah. You think to begin with, you have a couple of things. You think this can't be that hard, right? You know, because you figure that there must be an answer. And the other thing is you get into it with this idea that you can, you can make change. And that's a real driver. And a lot of people that are in housing and have been for years and years and years are really committed to make some positive change in their First Nation. Yeah.
And when you took on the job with the best of intentions, how did that go? Did you fix everything?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sure. No, because here I am still. And when was that? The mid-90s. And so I did housing management in Sartlip. And gradually, year by year by year, I started to figure out for my own self what the problem was. And to begin with, you think the problem's you. If I could just, then this problem would go away. But then I started looking at the problem from a bigger perspective and realized that I could, yes, as whichever report you talked about, if I did better, housing in Sartlip would improve. It's true, right. And it does. Housing managers, chiefs and councils, they make a difference and they make housing better or worse in their communities. It's true. But there is a ceiling on that where I realized, you know what? I can be the best housing manager in the world, but the problem is the thing I'm managing.
And I want you to talk about the history of because this has never worked. The system has never worked. Tell us a little bit about the national welfare housing model and how it doesn't work.
So I really quickly can go back in the 30s when
you don't have to be quick. Take your time. I think it's important because I think so many people see that there's the problem and it's like, but I don't really understand where it even comes from. And if we have to go back and dissect it, let's do that.
Okay. So let's go back to when Canada itself got involved in housing. Canada was never a country that really, and it never has been since, it hasn't liked to be involved in housing. Mm-hmm. But in the 30s, we had a housing crisis in Canada. Of course, we had a crisis. It was the Depression. But Canadians weren't able to access good housing, just mainstream Canadians. So we had Canada set up a whole lot of mechanisms in place so that we could borrow money, so that we had housing standards, inspections. This was all started in the 30s and 40s in order for regular folks in Canada to access good quality housing and access financial mechanisms that made it work for them.
Right.
That's what Canada did for housing. So now we have the housing market, for better or worse, in our society. On reserve, we also had a housing crisis. What the government did was set up a welfare system to deliver housing, because that's how they saw reserves. So what we had then was government programs, government grants, government services, all these things. This is how we deliver housing on reserve. And it's changed over the decades. They've kept trying to fix it. But let's you and me think for one moment whether housing by welfare program for an entire population of people is going to work. So that's why I say it wasn't ever designed to work, because you don't need to be any kind of specialist to know. If I just say that, you'd say, well, that's not going to work.
Right.
Yes, it didn't work. It's still not working.
And this is, I mean, I've heard people hypothesize, and I'm curious as to you've spent so much time researching this and looking into it. Do you think that this, looking at this model and seeing that it can't possibly work, and then seeing the application of it consistently not working, do you think that there is, the whole goal is that we want it to fail so people leave First Nations communities and assimilate?
Yes, and that would be that's sort of a theory that a lot of people have. In my studies, I haven't had to actually go there. That may be at the heart of it. I'm not sure that anybody consciously is thinking that. It is just what actually happens. Mm-hmm. So nobody's going to fix it because nobody really cares. When I moved to the reserve, I was 17 years old, and I remember telling my mother what it was like living on a reserve. And I says, it's like going to summer camp. It's not, nobody sees a reserve as like a legitimate community. Mm-hmm. It's like these programs, we're going to do paper mache this summer, and we're going to do popsicle sticks next summer. And there's no sense that these are legitimate communities where people live. And that was my observation as not a very old teenager.
Tell me, I appreciated your thoughts about, that we're known by where we live.
Right.
Share your thoughts on that with us, because I liked the messaging behind that.
Yes. So I think I told you that we have messaging that goes out. What do people know about reserve housing? They know it for two reasons. One, they've ever perhaps done a drive-by, mm-hmm. or they've seen a TV program. And then they decide what housing on reserve is like. We all know that. Mm-hmm. And what they imagine about on reserve housing is the most awful things, because that's what we see. We see on the news or in the newspaper, we see these awful things. But these are people who live in this. And I raised 3 children in reserve housing on a reserve. And it's my youngest daughter that I remember watching a TV news program on reserve housing, showing the typical thing that we all know and we've all seen, these awful houses. And it's not that they don't exist, but here's this little girl looking at that, crying and saying, "Mom, turn that off. Turn that off, because that's not how we are."
Yeah.
So then when she's thinking about herself, and when other people are thinking about them, with her, they're thinking of those houses. And there is a saying that an old Kickapoo teacher told, and he said, "By our houses you will know us." Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that is, an ice house, you know a whole lot about a person if that's the house they live in. Mm-hmm. A teepee or a longhouse like out here, you know a whole lot about everything about that person by looking at the house. And the sad reality was what my little girl said is, you know what? They think they know me by looking at those houses, and Mom, that hurts. So houses are our biggest and most identifiable expression of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And we have had generations of First Nations people living in houses that the rest of Canada are just appalled at. And that is it's one of the most serious effects of on-reserve housing, is that identity.
I want to get in a minute to the systemic problems. Like, this system isn't fixable. It needs to be kind of dismantled, and this needs to be shifted in a completely different direction. I like your ideas about that. So, Sylvie, I want to go back to you. Let's start about this system. It's not fixable. You don't believe that this system is fixable?
No, it is moving towards First Nations having a lot more control over their housing. So if I were to say, is there a fix? The first fix, or not the first fix, but the major fix, is that First Nations actually are in control of their own housing. Mm-hmm. But what that means, it's not just here, transfer this over. It means all the mechanisms in place.
What are the mechanisms? Like, what do they need to be in control of the housing?
Access to capital, access to money, the people that live on reserve, access to borrowing money if that's what they choose, social housing programs that were actually made for reserves, not just borrowed from mainstream programs that actually work in the sort of communities that they're being delivered in. So when I say First Nations need to be in control of their housing, that's within a context of there being sensible housing opportunities.
Right.
Yeah. So that is just a critical point, a critical part of fixing the housing problem.
Billions and billions of dollars have been spent over generations and generations on these homes that they're falling apart. There's not enough of them. There's overcrowding. Even the houses that are properly built, we hear all the time, yeah, it was a fine house if it's 4 people living in it, but when you have 16 people living in it, it's not adequately built, right? I think there's a perception that, people who live on these reserve houses don't know how to take care of a house. Is that part of something that you teach in the housing management program, is getting people involved in taking better care of the homes?
Yeah, I teach actually the managers and how to deliver houses. But if we want to teach something to somebody, you would teach them a new relationship to their house. So there's a very bad relationship to housing on reserves, because not only are we non-First Nations people and Canadian public looking in saying this doesn't work, the people themselves, it's not working for them. And this has gone on generation after generation, this relationship to housing not working.
And it's such an awful relationship. I mean, everywhere you go, that's one of the biggest things that you hear. It doesn't matter where you are. It's the complaints about housing, either the quality of housing, who gets the housing, the nepotism involved, and that's all over the place. The housing shortage, where the houses were built, and I think that is there a disconnect between where you see people? You talked about the relationship that people have with their homes. Is it a disconnect different than what anybody else would feel in a rental housing market, for example? You don't have to own your home to feel connected to your home.
You don't. No, you don't. But you have to own your house in the sense that we own this. This is ours. This thing that we're doing is ours in some way, and choice is a key part. And people who study housing say choice, even if it's a choice what color you want your walls, choice where you're going to rent. The less choice you have, the more problems there are with housing. We have a whole population of people that have for generations had no choice. Yeah. They have been assigned this housing. That is a long standing problem. So in lots of First Nations, let's talk positive, in lots of First Nations, they are shifting that up. And the people are starting to get choice about their houses. The First Nation is starting to get some control over their houses within the parameter of the system that we're working. You can have more choice or less choice. And the First Nations that are giving their people choice and are feeling in themselves that they're having choice about what sort of houses they have, the housing is improving. But as long as a person has no sense, and I don't mean ownership in that, I got the papers. I mean ownership in other words, that this is part of me. This is an expression of me. And as my daughter said when she was a little girl, Mom, that's not an expression of us. That makes me really sad. And that I know when I go to school, people think that that's me. It's not me. So when you're in that kind of world, what we need is one, choice. People need to have some choice. Another, control. And we all know that really super poor people have less control and less choices. But on reserve, we haven't had choices for anybody. Yeah, it's certainly amplified. Yep.
We have a few callers here. Let's go to one of our callers. We've got Paulette. Oh, we have Paulette back. Paulette, are you there?
Yes, hi.
How are you?
Not too bad.
Good. What did you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I'd like to say that back in the day, in the 70s, our houses were built with plywood and stuff like that, and they didn't have the mold problem or anything like that. It was easier to fix. There was no plastering to be done on it and anything like that.
And where are you calling from?
Mulbert, Ontario.
And are you in a house that was built in the 70s, or what's your circumstance?
No, my house has been built in about 40 years ago.
And how is it?
I'm living in an old house right now.
What is the situation for others in your community? Is there a housing shortage, or is it?
It's a lot of mold in between the windows when the dampness sets in, and if you get a spill on the sink, busted line or something, the mold sets in the house. The floor gets rotted, and everything. Like the floors aren't made the way they made them before.
Mm-hmm. Sylvia, I want to ask you about that. Is it? We hear lots of times it's the cheapest, bare bones materials. Some people say shoddy workmanship. Is that the biggest problem in our housing?
The material is not really that good. Like, it's the mold issue, the asbestos problem. Like I've been in buildings ever since my house burnt down, and I still haven't gotten nothing yet. I've been thrown into old houses all the time.
Well, my house is 110 years old, and it doesn't have mold, so I think it does speak to. Thanks for phoning, Paulette. Sylvia, just quickly here, we have to go to a break. But is it the shoddy workmanship? Is it the substandard materials? Is that the biggest problem in the housing crisis on First Nations?
It's not the biggest problem in the crisis, but Paulette is right. It is a huge problem, but no, there's lots of other problems, and that's more a symptom of a problem. It's more a symptom than the problem itself. Okay. If we spend all our time trying to fix that as if it's the problem, we haven't fixed the problem. We're just fixing the symptoms. Okay,
we have somebody who wants to ask you a question, Sylvia. Do we want to do that? I'm just asking Beverly, the producer here, if we want to do that before the break, or do we want to do that when we come back? Okay, we've got a question for you. Sylvia, we've got a caller. Hello there.
Hello?
What did you want to ask Sylvia?
Hello?
Is there a question you had for Sylvia?
Yeah, my question is relating to the upcoming federal election, and it's in regards to the housing crisis. So, you have a lot of the different parties, and I don't want to get too political here, but, you have the NDP party suggesting, we need more funding, and then you have the PPC on the other side, Maxime Bernier completely suggesting, just scrap the Indian Act and self-governance. And so, Sylvia, with your experience and knowledge, which of these solutions would you suggest to be the most effective or the most reasonable or the most practical for First Nations communities?
Okay, so this is a Sylvia Olsen answer, of course. I was around in the day that Paul Martin was working on the Kelowna Accord, and we were looking forward to some systematic change. You'll hear from me that I'm always talking about structural and systematic change rather than dropping money. The dropping money is not the answer. But what we had was the possibility for systematic change. That was the Liberals. Stephen Harper came in, and basically the lights went out on systematic change. And there was nothing going on in terms of real change in First Nations housing. Trudeau comes in, and he turned the lights back on. And while there is lots of people working in on-reserve housing that are, we're still ragging on him. Like, he's not doing enough. He's not doing it right, but he's doing something. And I'm not speaking from a Liberal, because I come from the West Coast and we're all green out there. So it's really not a political answer that I'm giving you. It's an answer that one party actually does want. Not sure that they know how to do it, but they want to give housing and other services back to First Nations people to find their own answers. I'm not crazy about some of the ways they're doing it, but they are the only party that has actually stepped up to that. And the drop more money into it thing, like we got with NDP constantly does that, that's a problem. It's a problem because the money
if you're not measuring outcomes, the money could be ineffectively, you're wasting everybody's time and energy and money.
The money has to come with structural change.
Yeah.
And structural change has to come with money. Lots of money.
Okay, we got to take a break. Daniel, thank you for calling in with that question. And Sylvia, thank you so much. I enjoy talking to you about this issue. We got to come take a break. When we come back, we're going to delve into housing problems for Indigenous people in urban centers, and we're going to go to the north where the housing crunch has a number of unique factors. So stay with us.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, or send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear what some of you are saying about the housing crunch. We put a poll on Facebook and Twitter, and we asked, in the past 10 years, has housing in your community improved or worsened? Jesse, what are the results?
Well, Melissa, we had over 200 respondents. 20% say housing on the community has improved, and 80% say housing has worsened. We also asked online, what are some housing concerns you have on or off reserve? From Victoria, they hire contractors that build cheap houses that don't last more than 10 years. Or Chief and Council will only pick their friends and family to get houses or renovations. Karen said, being more cold inside and mold, hydro high, losing heat, have to use plastics on windows to stay warm, old buildings off-res and on-res. Tammy said, off-reserve people never get a chance for banned homes. Waiting lists are ridiculous. From Daphne, there needs to be training programs available on reserve. Support for staffing. Have these two hand in hand is a good start. Sean said, another year wrapping plastic around my foundation to keep out cold air drafts. No hot water yet. Tank is old and rusty. Sean also added, hiring contractors off reserve. A lot will cut corners to get the job. They know they will get paid and rush the jobs. Plus, there is no inspection on these jobs after they are completed. And lastly, from Lily, the non-First Nation contractors cut corners and rip the band off all the time, and the housing department continues to hire them again and again. If you would like to add your opinion to our topic conversation, here's how. Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus, or send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
So in our first segment, we delved into the systemic dysfunction behind the never-ending housing crisis on reserves. Before I introduce you to our next guest, let's take a look at some statistics from homelesshub.ca. It's Canada's largest national research institute devoted to homelessness, and this is looking at urban centres. Not surprisingly, urban Indigenous people experience homelessness at a disproportionate rate. Quote, some sources have suggested that Indigenous homelessness in major urban areas ranges from 20 to 50% of the total homeless population, while others have reported that the range may be much wider, somewhere between 11 to 96%. According to Homeless Hub, 1 in 15 Indigenous people in urban centres are homeless, compared to 1 in 128 for the general population. This means that urban Indigenous people are 8 times more likely to experience homelessness. So, Christina Mays-Nino has spent her entire career collaborating with people living in poverty in urban centres across Western Canada. She's the executive director of the Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association, based here in Winnipeg. She co-authored Winnipeg's Street Health Report in 2011 and has published 2 chapters in edited books, Decolonizing Planning and Poor Housing. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on to chat about this. So Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population. What is the housing situation for us here in the city?
I think some of the things that you were talking about earlier with on-reserve housing leads to housing challenges in Winnipeg, because people move from First Nations for opportunities. They move for housing. A lot of people who I've interviewed who are experiencing homelessness, when you ask why they came to the city, they'll say, well, it was my only chance to get housing. But yet they end up here in Winnipeg homeless because they face the same challenges that someone experiencing poverty in Winnipeg would face, plus the racism and discrimination that they might face as an Indigenous person.
To get into housing.
Yes.
So I wanted to, we have problems related to poverty, but is there a housing challenge for people who are working class or middle class? Like, does that exist in urban centers?
It does to a certain extent, depending on the urban center. So in Winnipeg, housing is still relatively affordable compared to places like Toronto and Vancouver. In Toronto and Vancouver, I think middle class Canadians are struggling with housing regardless of their nationality, ethnicity. But Indigenous people struggle more because of racism and discrimination. In Winnipeg, I would say, I was looking at the statistics actually for different neighborhoods in Winnipeg, and Indigenous people have similar housing outcomes in areas like St. Boniface, St. Batel, Charleswood, compared to non-Indigenous households, which was a bit surprising to me.
Yeah,
actually.
that does sound surprising.
But in the inner city, there's a higher concentration of problems. So people are more likely to be paying more than 30% of their incomes on rent. They're more likely to be living in overcrowded housing. So I think the challenges related to housing for Indigenous people are concentrated, but they're still more than non-Indigenous households.
Sylvia had said when I was speaking to her yesterday that Winnipeg has some very innovative ways of tackling the off-reserve housing problems that Indigenous people are facing. So what do you? I mean, you see all of the groups that deal in housing throughout the province. What are some of the more interesting things that you've seen working, whether in Winnipeg or in Brandon, Portage la Prairie, Swan River?
We have a lot of really strong urban Indigenous housing organizations who own and manage their own housing for Indigenous families. And when I tell them, tell me what's unique and special about you, they'll say, oh no, we're the same as everyone else. But in reality, they're different because they treat people differently than the private sector does, and even the public housing. One housing provider said to me, I'll never evict someone because they can't pay the rent. The amount of rent they're paying is so minimal. It's 30% of their income. Their income's not very high. I'm going to work with them to make sure they can pay the rent, and eventually they do. Yeah. So that's innovative. They might not call it innovative, but it truly is, because they're working with people. They're supporting them where they're at. They're helping them get ahead. They're showing people how to do everything from use the temperature, use the furnace in their house, how to care for a home in a way that they might not have learned either because of that lack of choice in a First Nations home, or because maybe they were living with 18 other people in a home on their reserve. When they move into Winnipeg, they might need some support learning how to take care of their home. And so a lot of nonprofit Indigenous organizations are doing that work.
And these are relatively new organizations in a lot of ways, this kind of from this generation, right?
Yeah.
And are they able to increase? It's one thing to be managing the houses better and to helping people get into the existing houses that you have, but if you don't have enough houses to get people into, you're not ever really getting ahead of the problem. What is the challenge for Indigenous housing organizations to be growing the housing base that they have? What are the challenges?
Well, there's no funding right now for new housing. So providing good, affordable housing to low-income people requires ongoing funding from somewhere, ideally from government, because in Canada we've signed on to agreements saying that we believe we have a right to housing in Canada. So if we have a right to housing, that means that people who are living in extreme poverty will get some support from government with housing the same way they will with healthcare, the same way they will with education. Right now, a lot of urban Indigenous housing organizations are facing this challenge that they signed agreements for the lifetime of the mortgage of their houses when they were built, and those are expiring as the mortgages expire, which means they may not even get the funding to continue to support the housing that they already have. That's an impending crisis here in Canada. The federal government had committed to continuing those, but we don't really know what that's going to look like. They keep on saying, well, we'll continue it for a while, but eventually you have to be self-sustaining.
Yeah.
So growth isn't really, in Manitoba at least, it's not something that groups are thinking about. They're just thinking about preserving what they have.
Yeah, like a hamster on the wheel, just trying to keep this going and not being able to grow. We have another caller. Mary Louise, are you there?
Hello.
Hey, what did you have to add to the conversation?
Pardon?
Did you have a question or a comment?
No, I have a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
I hope I'm not going to be stepping on somebody's toes, but
No, step
I
on
come
toes.
from
We
a
like
reserve
that.
too in Manitoba, and I've seen good housing. I'm 75 years old. I've seen good housing. I've seen bad housing. You know what I mean? Pitiful housing made on I don't know what. But anyway, over the years, when my deceased husband was living, we maintained our home. We kept it clean. We kept the yard clean. We made sure our house got painted every year, every summer. We kept our yard beautiful. We had garden. We looked after our home, is what I'm saying. And for people that don't look after their home, of course, it's going to look like a piece of shit. Not painting, you're not fixing your windows, whatever needs to be fixed. Even if you don't have very much money, my girl, you still need to maintain your home, something that you can be proud of.
Yeah. Is
But
this
at the
something
same
that you've
time,
seen? When did
having
you
said
see
that-
this change? Like you've been around 75 years. When did you see there was a shift from pride in your home to people letting their homes get
That's
run
what
down?
it takes. It takes pride. You need to be proud because it's supposed to be your home. But at the same time, having said that, things have changed over the years. This was 1968 that we got our home built, and we looked after it. But now, in this time, this day and age, we all know what the problems are. We know what the problems are: gambling, drinking, drugs. It's a big issue on every reserve. It doesn't matter where you go, what reserve you go to, you're going to find all that stuff. So you're spending your money there, you're not spending it on your home. You're not trying to fix up your home.
And what do you think is the solution? How could we get people to be taking better care of the homes that they're in?
I know the government doesn't give you very much money to do anything. You couldn't build a toilet, an outside toilet, with the money they provide First Nations. It's pitiful, the money that they do give, and it's always the same people that get the help anyway.
Yeah, we hear that all the time
That
too.
seems to be a big issue on every reserve too. Only certain people get the housing, certain people get the help.
Yeah. Well,
And I don't know what it takes to wake people up. I don't know what it takes for chief and council to see the despair that we have in our community. There's despair.
Yeah.
You know, it's sad.
Thanks for calling,
I
Mary
would
Louise.
never go back there. I would never move my children back there. My grandchildren never grew up there, and I'm glad. I thank God every day for that.
Yeah. That's unfortunate. Thank you, Mary Louise. So this is, I mean, you must hear this too. If you're stuck with existing housing units, they have to be cared for and maintained. You said earlier that there's a rush of people who leave the reserve because of the housing crunch is there. So they come into the city where they face housing challenges there, unless you're, middle class, maybe two incomes. What's the solution to? Is there anybody who helps people understand the basic ways of taking good care of your home, whether it's an apartment, whether it's a house, how to be a good resident of those homes?
A lot of urban Indigenous housing providers will, so those are nonprofit organizations. I would say public housing maybe is a bit stretched in terms of the support that they don't provide as much support as maybe they could. There are a number of programs across Canada that have been funded called Housing First programs. Those are specifically designed to end homelessness. So they work with folks who have been chronically homeless for more than 6 months in the previous year, and they provide intensive supports. Usually it's for the first week it's visiting them daily, and then weekly after that, and it's helping people with everything from budgeting to grocery shopping and help connect them to the community. So that includes taking care of a house.
Yeah.
Because there's people that will, leave a window open not knowing the pipes will freeze in winter and those sorts of things. Yeah. So there are programs that do that, but not at the scale that we need them.
Yeah. I think we have another caller or two. Are you there?
Hello?
Carol, hey, thanks for joining us.
Hi, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. Yeah, so I just had a comment to make about the housing crisis on the reserves. First of all, it's shameful, and I really feel that, so if they're hiring contractors that are doing substandard work, maybe get rid of those contractors, train and maybe hire people from within the reserve. And if you've got housing councils that's showing blatant nepotism and favoritism, maybe get rid of them as well and vote some new people in that actually have new strategies, new ideas, because I think it's a shame, and it just looks bad on Canada's part, the way that some people have to live, like in third world conditions. It's just wrong, and it makes me sad. So that was just my 2 cents thrown in there.
Thanks for calling in. Thanks to Carol. We wanted to take a look at something specific to the north, where there's the conditions, the housing crisis in the north is far different than what is experienced in the south. Back in 2017, APTN's Kathleen Martins traveled to Nunavut to explore a housing problem unique to the territory. Many working Inuit don't have anywhere to live, never mind if you're unemployed, you have no options. Southerners who get jobs or who go there for jobs get first dibs on housing, and what little housing is left over is unaffordable to many, as the wages paid don't cover the expensive food, plus the expensive rent, plus the expensive utilities that you see up in the north, specifically in Nunavut. APTN Investigates was taken on a tour of a shantytown in Iqaluit where many live in tents within small plywood shacks, without heat or plumbing. Let's take a look.
He works too. You could see a big build right here, workers built. Most of these Inuits who live in these shacks have full-time jobs, but they can't get subsidized staff housing.
We didn't meet this man, but a Nuktakau let us into his shack.
It's been a very big common problem up here, even with like the companies. Like I heard of several construction companies where they buy their friends plane tickets all the time to go on vacations, but Inuits get nothing.
Nuktakau says not every Inuk can afford to pay rent and buy groceries in the same month, because the prices are just too high.
That's why we live in shacks, and only non-Inuits have been purchasing homes.
We're hoping to take a deeper delve into what's happening in the north. We've run out of time for this segment. Thank you, Christina, for joining us and talking about off-reserve housing issues. When we come back, we've got a brand new season of APTN Investigates, which kicked off last week. Housing was the focus of a 2-part investigation. We've got reporter Chris Reed joining us when we come back with what he's uncovered. Stay with us. Welcome back. A brand new season of APTN Investigates kicked off last Friday, starting off with a 2-part look at housing on reserve. Joining me now in studio is the reporter behind that Healing Housing series, Chris Reed. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
So what got you interested in the whole topic of tackling housing in a 2-part series?
Well, we had a call from a guy named Alan Isfeld. He's a Red Seal carpenter. He's from Winnipeg. Former building inspector with the city of Winnipeg. He has done a lot of work in First Nations across the country.
First Nations guy himself?
Yes, he's from Wayway-Sikapo First Nation. And he traveled all over selling building materials for a lot of years. So he's connected with a lot of communities across the country. He's done a lot of building on reserve, building houses, building schools, all sorts of things. So he knows it inside out. He's all about quality control. And he says, he talks about this devolution moment that happened in 1996. What happened was the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation said, okay, from now on, we are not responsible for ensuring that the building being done on reserves
is done properly,
is done up to code. From now on, First Nations are responsible. So you are going to get the inspections done. You're going to certify at 3 stages in the building process and say it's okay. Yeah. Isfeld says what this has meant in actuality is, of course, that the inspections being done are superficial and they're really just about green lighting the next stage of funding. And this is what we're kind of seeing the result of today with all this mold in houses and that sort of thing.
Well, it's a cute way for the federal government to say, oh, you guys, we're giving you responsibility for this now. Look at how nice of us this is.
Yeah.
But without any of this structure in place in that system, as Sylvia had mentioned, it's not going to
Yeah.
It's not going to work out, and it hasn't, as we've seen since '96.
And Isveld says, you know, for him, it's a betrayal of trust. And the other thing that he talks about is mold. You know, he zooms in on the mold, and he says, you know, in these northern communities especially, what happens is you've got trucks driving up over the ice road that's only open a couple of months a year, they splashed with water, materials getting splashed with water, then materials get left, you know, on the reserve, out in the open for months at a time, sometimes in certain situations. And then when you, even before you've started building the building, you're primed like a petri dish to just grow mold like crazy.
Yeah. Okay, we do have a video now. I wanted to see a chunk from your show, the first part that aired on Friday. Let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back, and then we'll look at what's coming up this Friday.
We need help. Every year we're getting further and further behind.
And they just say it's not important for them to fix it. We have more important things to do other than your house.
Here, up there. I just cleaned it up 2 weeks ago.
I need them to fix all this. It could have been prevented, all this. They would have listened to me the first time.
It's a betrayal. It's a betrayal of trust as far as I'm concerned. They had a fiduciary responsibility to provide housing for First Nations people on this earth.
Who owns the houses? The First Nation or the government is disputed. Who owns the house? The person who lives in it or the First Nation is also a disputed.
When are you going to help out Carolyn Bennett? Stop treating us like we're shadow.
This is, I think, just off the top of my head, probably the 6th time that housing has been the source of an investigation by the investigative unit since I've been here for 10 years. I mean, are we going to keep doing housing stories, or when you're the one who did the latest research, are we getting closer to solutions?
Well, 3 things make me cautiously hopeful. First, we got Sylvie Olson. She is teaching this certificate course, as you found out earlier, for First Nations housing managers. She is essentially training an army of housing managers across the country. That's got to have some kind of effect. Second of all, we've got Isveld. Alan Isveld is a guy who's working within the industry. He's got nothing to lose at the moment because he's mostly retired. He says whatever he wants. And
we like those people.
Yeah, yeah. And so he wrote a letter to Indigenous Services Minister Seamus O'Regan. We're keeping our eye on that guy, on Isveld, and what's happening there. The third thing is, of course, Indigenous Services Canada itself, right on their website, they say they are all about getting out of the business of delivering services.
Yeah.
So what if housing for Indigenous people was run entirely by Indigenous organizations? That is supposedly something that might be coming down the pipe.
If you set them up to do it, right? You can't just quit delivering and say, good luck.
Right.
Okay, well, I look forward, I thought we would have time to watch a trailer from your part 2, but we do not because we're running out of time. But that is coming up on Friday, part 2 of Christopher's housing, healing housing. That's going to be coming up after APTN National News. I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And I look forward to part 2. That's our show for this Wednesday, putting housing in focus. I thank all of our guests who have joined us today, and to all of you, our viewers. If you want to share this, you can go to our website. The episode will be available as a download as a podcast on our website, aptnnews.ca/podcast. And you can catch up on any of the shows that you've missed on that same website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Melissa Ridgen. We will see you back here next week. Have a great afternoon.